Just like we have to remind ourselves of the gospel every day, as teachers and preachers, we need to remember that at the end of the day, we're not just trying to fill people's heads with like gospel truth.
Yeah.
We're trying to see them come to know the gospel so that they can have gospel change.
Yes. All right, we're ready for season 2, episode 1 of Hey Listen.
Wow.
Exactly.
I don't even know what to say. Year 2 and
right.
like 50 plus episodes, and it's just gone by fast.
Yes.
And we've had some time off, and
I had a little bit of time of rest and break in between recording and ready for the new season. Back as we started planning this, Colby and I spent hours sitting and, just dreaming up episodes and guests. And I am excited for the things we have coming for season 2.
Me too. And, last year, honestly, just as a way of almost like an apology, I mean, we were learning all about this. We were just trying to figure out. We didn't spend as much time, I think, planning out the year. We were just week by week trying to think of something. And you guys have done a great job as I've looked at the Excel spreadsheet that is incredibly detailed. We're not going to overproduce this year, but I think that this year is going to be a lot of fun because we've added, not today, but we've added another camera, so we'll be able to have guests. And so we're going to be much more intentional this year in bringing in some new voices and talking about some things outside of my area, your area. As we look back to last year, we had to kind of stick with what we know, and my area as pastor, and your area as children's minister, and we're going to bring these other voices on as it goes along. It's going to be good. It's going to be good.
Yeah, I think so. I'm excited. We'll have a variety of people, members of the church, staff members, and even a couple community members.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of great things planned.
Yeah, I've made some phone calls to a few friends, believe it or not, I have some, and that are in the state and do things in Southern Baptist life that are kind of, beyond Springfield, but certainly resources we can tap into that I think as Southern Baptists, we have so many good things that often the local church doesn't experience just because they don't ask. Like we have these people in Jefferson City who would love to come to our church and would come to any church, regardless of size of church, and help out. And so we're going to talk about some of those things, not all of them this year, but there's a handful of those conversations we can have to make our church members and anybody watching this podcast aware of some of the great ministries that are in the larger Baptist world.
Yes. And we even have a whole week of episodes planned for Holy Week. So just really bringing some new exciting things to shake it up in season 2.
It is good to be back.
Yes. All right. Well, speaking of being back, let's jump right in. Our topic today to talk about is what is the gospel, which seems like maybe a silly thing to even have to ask. But as I read the book that you recommended, we'll be talking about, and just thought about this, I thought, oh man, what an important thing to be asking, and to even more so being understanding.
We use Christian language in the church, obviously. I mean, but, we use a word like gospel, but we're careless with it because we use the word, and we even could say we treasure the word, but we've really not thought too much about the word and the concept and what it is. And the idea of the gospel is simple, and we're going to talk about that in some of the most simple ways to think about it. But it also really is a big picture word. It covers all of Scripture in one sense. And this is where, let's just go ahead and start. Really, the gospel, it's a word that causes us to focus on that which is the most important thing of all, which is the cross of Jesus Christ. I think if we'll start there and talk about the cross, that's what we need to understand. The gospel doesn't work. It's not good news unless we look to the cross.
Absolutely. I think, we, in the book talks about this, but we assume a lot that people understand, both in kids ministry and with adults alike. We assume they understand what that means.
Yeah.
But we're going to kind of break that down and look at really what is the gospel.
Yeah. And this book we're talking about is written by Greg Gilbert. I've met him one time at a conference. He's just absolutely brilliant. He's very involved in the 9 Marks movement with Mark Dever out of Washington, D.C. He pastors the church that historically has kind of been their they call it their church to the west. They call it Capitol Hill West, I think is what they call it, jokingly. But he's just a very clear thinker, and he wrote this book. And so when we were talking about this subject, I said, oh, yeah, there's this book. I remember I read it, and I thought I'd read it like 5 years ago, and I was looking, and it was printed 16 years ago, and I was like, oh, my goodness. A lot of time. So it was printed. It was published in 2010.
Yeah.
And
a lot of life has happened since then.
So I want to start with something that's a little on the heavier side. So this morning, it's only 125 pages. It's a small book. So I went through it this morning, and as I was looking through it, I opened it up and I thought, wow, Greg had all of these amazing people do a little blurb for it. So I'm one of those guys that when I read a book, a lot of times I will read the blurbs at the beginning,
Yeah, sure.
right? Yeah, just to see who's recommending it and things. And this was in 2010. It would have no doubt have been like an all-star team of pastors and denominational leaders. We're talking seminary presidents. Really, I was like, wow. I mean, if I wrote a book and had 2 of these, like 12 blurbs, I would feel like I had done something well. So one, it just shows you that at the time that he wrote this, Greg was known and still is, but really, this book was read by a lot of people and lifted up pretty highly. And when you read it, you see why. Okay. But here's the heavy bit. So I'm reading through there. And some of the names, I know these people. Like I've had lunch with them, or I've met them at conferences, like I said. And I won't go into great detail here. 2 of the individuals that gave a blurb for this book have had moral failures and are no longer in ministry. 1 has committed suicide. Another person has completely walked away, not only from the pastorate, but has very loudly talked about the deconstruction of his faith, which we talked a little bit about deconstruction last year. So the reason I bring this up is because when I opened the book, I was amazed at the heavy-hitting all-stars that were like, you need to read this because the gospel is important and we need to learn as much about it. And then realizing that 5 that I knew of, 5 of those who gave words of encouragement to read this have had major issues in their life. Now, I'm not going to say that any of those individuals, except for the one who's obviously said he's deconstructed his faith, the moral failures and things of that nature don't mean that you have walked away from Jesus. It means that you sinned and you failed. But I wanted to bring this up because it just hit me like a ton of bricks this morning. Because when I read this book the first time 16 years ago, those were all those guys were my heroes. Yeah. And because they weren't able to walk with Jesus and you know, you say, what do we need to do with the gospel? Well, one person has said we need to preach the gospel to ourselves every day. Yeah. And so I'm reading the blurbs at the beginning this morning, and I'm like, wow, this is so true. The gospel and what it means, if we are not meditating on it every day, if we are not staying anchored to Jesus every day. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how many books you've written or how many sermons you've preached or how many mission trips you've gone on. If you are not growing in the gospel every day, you're in trouble. Yeah. So I want to start there to say, oh my, 1, I'm old. 16 years have passed since I first read this book. And then 2, it was a little heartbreaking this morning, especially the one with the person who committed suicide was a friend, and it was devastating. It was a really hard thing. For his family, of course, just a terrible thing, and that. But in ministry, he was a person that, in so many ways, we had studied together in seminary, and he was one of the smartest guys and the most talented guys I've ever known. And it's just a reminder that this fallen world, we need answers, and Jesus is the only answer.
Yeah. Many, many years ago, I went to a conference, kids ministry conference, and the breakout was called "The Gospel is for Believers Too." And I just, pieces of that have stuck with me through ministry for many years. Yeah. And it was a lot on caring for volunteers and stuff. But that reminder that as ministry leaders, we need the gospel
Absolutely.
every day.
Absolutely.
So let's look at it.
Yeah.
What is the gospel? So I know in the What is the Gospel book that we've been referencing, he kind of breaks it down into 4 areas: God, man, Christ, and response.
Right.
So I thought maybe we would just kind of walk through
Sure.
what those are. So starting with God.
Yeah.
Seems like simple enough, but each of these, who made us, who are we accountable to? He's not just loving, but he's holy and just.
Yeah. So when we ask the question, what is the gospel? The first thing that you and I would do is we'd start trying to answer that from our point of view and perspective. But let's rewind the tape and let's answer the question: if I am living in 60 AD, 30 years removed from the time of Christ, when some of the first epistles of Paul were being written, when the Gospels, maybe Mark for sure, was in print. Certainly Jesus' sayings were flowing readily in the Christian community at that time. Let's ask the question, what is the gospel, and try to answer it from a mostly Jewish perspective, first century Jewish perspective. So from that perspective, we would say that the gospel represents the answer that God's people had been looking for over 1,000 years. The Old Testament Hebrew scriptures made clear that there was a son of David coming, and there was the idea or concept of a Messiah, which in the Greek would be the Christos or Christ. Everybody knew that we needed, the world needed this Messiah who was, when we really dig deep into the scriptures, the Old Testament, we see that the Messiah would be a prophet, like Moses, okay? He would be a priest, so he would give insight into sacrifice for sin, right? And he would be a king because he would be in the lineage of David. So prophet, priest, and king. So the gospel is, if you think about it, if you've been waiting for maybe a year for an answer to something, and finally the answer comes, that's a good day. Something you've been praying about, something you've been thinking about, worrying about, answers that just seem to elude us. You wait a year and it comes, and man, you're going to throw a party. So good news, in that sense, gospel means good news. It's good news because, like, for over 1,000 years, we've been waiting for the answer. And then here it is. It's Jesus and the cross. So he is the manifestation of God, the answer. This week I was writing a sermon in Matthew and was reminded that, when Jesus came, he would say, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And it seems kind of arrogant. That's how the rabbis would have heard that. But the truth is, every rabbi up until Jesus was trying to interpret the law. So they would say, well, I think this means this, and I think it means that. So it's good news when God sends his only son and says, listen, you've missed it. Here it is. Here's the answer. And for me, and I think you would agree too, in life, we're all looking for answers. And some of the most frustrating moments in life are when we just have ambiguity. We don't have clarity. The gospel, the good news is now we have the clear vision of God's plan. His redemptive work is through Jesus. His death on the cross satisfies sin, right? And so from a first century Jewish perspective, we finally have the true rabbi, the true Messiah. We have if you can think of it this way too, another way I thought of it this morning was, it's kind of like if you had a puzzle and you're missing one piece, but you need that one piece to really get the gist of what the full picture is. Boom. That's Jesus. That's good news. The puzzle is complete. The picture is complete. And now we know what God has been doing since the beginning, since the fall, to create for us a path to heaven and eternal life.
Absolutely. When we're sharing the gospel with kids, we use a tool called The Gospel God's Plan for Me. Lifeway came out with it back in 2017, I believe, and that's what they've used in a lot of their curriculum, their VBS and stuff. But it starts with God rules, and for kids to understand, he rules. He created everything and it was good. And then it leads to we sinned. Bad news comes real quick with that. But they have to understand that it starts with God rules and
Yep.
he created, everything, including you. But that whole like making him the ruler of your life, the king of your life.
Yeah.
That understanding is important.
Yeah, Gilbert does a good job, and it's important for us to know, like especially in our world today, where there's competing views for creation, right? Yeah, a big part of the gospel is that God created the heavens and the earth. We do have to go to the beginning, and the gospel isn't necessarily the whole redemptive story. He at the end of the book he says, "Listen, it's not the creation, fall, redemption, glorification," which is how we sort of put the Bible into 4 distinct categories, and we think of like all of time and eternity. He says, that's not the gospel. The gospel, we have to kind of get down to the cross pretty quick, right? So the gospel narrative, yes, but that I wanted us to really think about it though. It is the gospel is kind of like the most important part of the Bible narrative. And so we have to look at it. But yes, we have to look at those early chapters of Genesis and say, okay, God is a creator. Things were good, things were bad. There's some bad news. Before we can get to good news, we have to understand the bad news, right? And I've said it before, you cannot be saved until you know you're lost. So never lost, never saved.
Right. I mean, that's one of the first things we ask kids, what is sin? Usually they know what sin is.
Yep.
Have you ever sinned? No.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I thought Gilbert was good in saying that, like, when we talk about sin and its problems, we're always thinking about other people's sins, right? It's like, there's this big problem in the world and it's called sin and it's everybody else. And, Gilbert says, no, why don't you start by looking at your own sin? And I was sharing with someone yesterday that, years ago, people, when they were trying to understand God, they were struggling with the problem of evil, like, why do bad things happen to good people? And this one scholar says, no, the question that Generation Z is asking is, when is God going to punish evil? So they're more worried about justice in terms of God punishing evil than why good people suffer. But what we would need to say is, be careful asking that question, because the assumption is that you are good, that you're waiting for someone else to get punished, but you better watch out, because your sin has contributed to the larger problem. The good news is that no matter what our sin contribution is, God's contribution in salvation is better. It's bigger. It actually resolves the tension and the dilemma. So when we look at the Bible as a drama, okay, with a beginning and an end, and those 4 categories I mentioned a moment ago, what we have is the resolution. The gospel is the resolution. And so I would keep saying, as we think about what is the gospel, we have to for me, I just have a picture of the cross in my mind. I do not want to take one step away from the cross when I'm thinking about the gospel, because at the gospel, we have the intersection of everything. All the answers to justice, all the answers to sin, all the answers to eternal life really emanate from that cross.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've talked about God, and we've been talking a little bit about, sin. So in the book, the second part is man. And, so what's the problem? We've sinned and are accountable for that rebellion. But often we're looking at, everyone else's sin. We talk about, kids understanding that. And I think, kids need to remember, we all need to remember that it's not just a list of bad choices, but it's the heart. Sometimes I think even maybe we ask forgiveness for that choice, but not from where it came from.
Yeah, I think our big problem is that we lean in the direction of the Pharisees, and we think about religion and faith more as keeping a set of rules. But the great poets of Christianity over the years, Dante and others, push us in the direction of, no, the issue is man's inability to have a relationship with God, an unwillingness to, obey. I mean, the rules, if we want to draw near to God, we need to be obedient. But it seems like we sort of miss that like there's a breakdown fundamentally in our relationship with God. And again, this morning we have a prayer group that meets, and I just, more and more as I gather together with men to pray and people to pray, so much of our prayer, especially when you're around a bunch of preachers, they sound like they're preaching and they're praying. Like prayer is just talking to God, right? And we make it a production, but it should just be a conversation. So it just seems to me like when we talk about the gospel, we need to understand that it's a pathway to right relationship. But we need to not lose the humanness of what that means.
Yeah.
Relationship, right? Man is out of kilter with God.
Yeah.
And we can do a bunch of things that are good. We can, obey the 10 Commandments. I would hope you would. But at the end of the day, if we're cold and indifferent towards the Heavenly Father and towards Jesus, it's not good. So the gospel reminds us not only is there's a solution, but there's also a pathway towards relationship.
Right. And I think from the parenting side of things, we can model that with our kids really well by asking them for forgiveness, showing when I mess up.
Good.
I this morning, I had to do that with my son. I snapped a little quicker than I should have, and before he walked out the door, I made sure to grab him and apologize because it's important. I'm sorry. I messed up.
Right.
Please forgive me.
I think I'm sorry is the most powerful, maybe, it's 2 words, contraction in a word, but anyway, so 3, I guess, but I'm sorry. I think that is the number one way to keep a marriage healthy. I think it's the number one way to keep children in church. I think it's the number one way to make sure that the office is full of unity. The people who seem to always have the most trouble in relationships are those who struggle the most to just own it.
Yeah.
And, again, with the gospel, when we look at it, there is absolutely no way around it. You have to own it. You have to own it, and you have to go to the Lord and ask for forgiveness. And so the gospel does have, the bad news and, that kind of humility where we own our part in it and say that, it's not like sin in general. That's the problem. It's my sin.
Yeah. So the next piece is Christ. And when I was thinking about this, I think about, both of us have gone to Lesotho and shared 2 kingdoms. And I love the way it's written in 2 kingdoms. And it says, and at just the right time, God sent Christ.
Yes.
And, I've lingered on that a lot of just that reminder. He did have a plan in that, and he sent his son, Jesus.
Yes, absolutely. That's the Galatians language Paul uses in Galatians when the time was fulfilled. And we also see that kind of in the Gospels there in Luke in particular, some of the little songs and courses and hymns that he includes there. Yes, absolutely. And what we need to realize is when we're reading the Bible, we are blessed because we're seeing we get to see the full picture. And I'm always amazed at the faith of the Old Testament saints because they didn't have the full picture. They were looking at it like in situ, in the middle of it, right? And it's just hard sometimes to really get a feel for what's going on when you don't take a step back and look at the larger picture. And sometimes in life we can't do that. We're in the middle of the fight. It's a mess, And so I'm really thankful for the great faith of those Old Testament saints. But for us, we do have the full picture, and we can look at it and we can say, okay, yeah. I mean, and I was telling someone the other day, I think it was Kelsey, we were talking about Lesotho and how Lesotho has a chance for a great revival because they've built these beautiful roads that weren't there just 10 years ago. When we were first going to Lesotho, it was a much harder journey. And when you talk to those individuals that were on that, some of them were riding horses to get to these places, right? And we didn't have those issues when I was there just a few months ago. So now take that and look at the Roman roads. For the first time in human history, you have these roads that stretch all through the Mediterranean world. So it was the fullness of time. There was the roads of the Romans. There was the common language of Greek. A lot of things had to be just perfect, but God was on top of it. And so the gospel, the good news, not only came, but it came and could spread like wildfire because it was the proper time.
Absolutely. So then that last piece, which I love, I shared at the beginning, gospel, God's plan for me. It starts with God rules, we sinned, God provided, he sent Jesus. Jesus gives, and then we respond. And we really land there with kids and have, more points from that. But it's not just the knowledge of it, but it's that response that has to come with it.
Amen. The gospel can be a known factor, but it has to be a received factor. And the language is always passive. When we look at salvation, it's something that we don't achieve. It's something that we receive. It's not something that we figure out. It's something we accept. and we accept it in the sense, again, passive. In fact, I often will say, don't say accept, say receive, because that's more dominant in the passive sense. But yes, at some point when we look at the gospel, we have to say, are you going to say yes to this? And that's why I think having an invitation is still a good thing. At the end of preaching the gospel every Sunday, we have an opportunity to respond to the gospel message. And again, what are we responding to? Well, the message of the Bible, which focuses on the teachings of Jesus, which culminates in the cross, and then the resurrection. So we accept what Jesus did for us on the cross, and then we also then can believe that we have the hope of resurrection life.
Back in an episode in season 1, I don't even remember exactly what the topic was, but we talked a little bit about salvation and, that response with kids, and how we're cautious with that with kids, because we don't want an emotional response. We don't want a mass response. But you really challenged me that day, and you said, I think we're still not offering that enough. And I've really tried to carefully, change that a little bit in kids ministry, because we do in kids ministry and in big church, all of that, we want to make sure kids are getting an opportunity to respond, to talk to someone, to pray with someone. I'm texting parents asking if they would like to come down and join those conversations, but we have to give the opportunity to respond.
Yes, and I think that because we've seen, as we said in that episode, a lot of corruption, mass evangelism, everybody raise your hand, now you're all going to heaven kind of thing. The pendulum always seems to swing too far the other direction. Right. And so as I've watched over the years, I because I don't want that to happen, I've seen some maybe questionable practices there. But I've really had to challenge my own self in terms of, I was talking to a friend one time, a fellow preacher, and he had listened to a couple of my sermons, and he was like, hey, just don't forget to invite people to accept Jesus, to receive Jesus. And you have to be, just like we have to remind ourselves of the gospel every day, as teachers and preachers, we need to remember that at the end of the day, we're not just trying to fill people's heads with like gospel truth. Yeah. We're trying to see them come to know the gospel so that they can have gospel change.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think, what do we do with this? From the parenting perspective, again, I just want to remind parents, keep these conversations as normal pieces of your rhythm.
Yes. Constantly
pointing your kids to Jesus through your own modeling it. Let them see you read the Bible, so that they know you're in the Word, that you're growing in your faith, but owning our own mistakes, helping kids navigate when we're scolding them. Let's talk about what that is, and the opportunity for response in that.
Well, I want to end with a kind of an out of left field kind of thing. So when I was looking at the notes I wrote in my book when I read this 16 years ago, I made a passing reference to Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in one of the margins. And so let me just explain what I mean by that. He wrote a trilogy years ago. He was not a believer, but he's always interacting in his books with God and the universe. And he has a very, it's not always good, but you can tell here's a guy that really was trying to understand why the world and why the universe is so messed up. And so at the end of the book, so the last book is called So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. Talk about a random title, which is actually a funny story where he gets that. But I won't go into that. So at the very end of the book, all the main characters, they decide that they want to see God's last message to creation. And so the last part of the book, they climb this mountain. They have to go on this pilgrimage to go see in 30-foot tall, flaming letters, God's last message to creation. And Douglas Adams spells it out letter by letter. So you have to write it out. And here's what it is. We are sorry for the inconvenience. Now, that's hilarious. And it's incredibly sad because in Douglas Adams' view, the world is a mess. It's an inconvenient, terrible thing, and there are no answers. Paul comes along in 1 Corinthians 15:57, and he says, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through Jesus Christ. Douglas Adams, we are sorry for the inconvenience. The world without the gospel can only see the inconveniences and messiness of the universe. But when we see what Paul saw, when we have Jesus in our hearts, we have victory, and that's the gospel.